Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your Adulthood and Aging online psychology class. And I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in health and health disorders. Some of this information will be slightly redundant from last week because, as we talked about already, the factors that predict physical health also predict mental health and kind of longevity throughout life. All right, so with that said, let's jump into it. So we talked about this last week, differences between primary and secondary aging, with primary aging kind of being these universal biological processes, and secondary aging being quote-unquote controllable, but with the caveat that structures kind of dictate the range of possible decisions given a neighborhood or a state or a country. Top three risk factors for death are high blood pressure, tobacco use, and high blood glucose. Moving on to definitions of morbidity and mortality. Morbidity rate is an illness rate. It's characterized as consisting of acute conditions versus chronic conditions. Mortality rate, probability of dying in 1 year. So we have chronic conditions kind of being mortality and kind of being calculated as the probability of dying in 1 year, and morbidity rate typically associated with acute conditions and illness rate. Again, kind of just rough definitions here. We have to operationalize these terms in some way. Life expectancy versus lifespan. Lifespan, or maximum lifespan, is referred to as the greatest age reached by any member of a given species. For humans, the lifespan is currently, or the maximum lifespan, I should say, is currently between 120 and 125. Life expectancy is defined as the average number of years that members of a population or species live. The global life expectancy for those born in 2019 is 72 years old. Females about 74, males about 70. Women live longer than men around the world, and the gap between the sexes have remained the same since the 1990s. And again, we talked about this in the previous chapter, kind of this idea of a theoretical maximum lifespan based on a number of potential avenues or reasons, one being the Hayflick limits, and there's other reasons, but kind of the idea here is that theoretically there's a maximum lifespan for each species, with humans being about 120 to 125. Looking at low-income countries or post-colonial countries, number of phrases, global south. Overall life expectancy ranges from 61 years in the African region, according to the World Health Organization in Africa, to 77.5 years in the European region. The global life expectancy increased by 5.5 years between 2000 and 2016. The life expectancy in low-income countries, about 63 years old, is 18 years lower than in high-income countries. In high-income countries, the majority of people who die are old, while in low-income countries, almost 1 in 3 deaths are children under 5 years of age. The United States ranks 45th in the world for life expectancy. So here you kind of can see that your developmental context makes a big difference in your life, literally your chances of living and dying to X amount of years old. In the case of low-income countries, with the majority people who dying a bit below 5 years of age, and kind of speaking to kind of the historical legacy of resource extraction and kind of colonialism in these countries, and who thus kind of have lower levels of income, lower unstable institutions compared to global north or high-income countries. It's have much more resources and much more thorough healthcare systems, but obviously the United States kind of standing out here, despite being kind of the first or second, depending on how you calculate it, richest country in the world, being 45th in the world for life expectancy, which could be related to a whole host of issues. And it's also important to note that the life expectancy by race and disability status and class varies greatly. With the richer you are, the longer kind of you're living compared to poorer individuals, disabled individuals, and historically, and then kind of that crossover with people of color. In general, we'll talk about some exceptions to having shorter lifespans in the United States. Healthy life expectancy, HLE, takes into account current age-specific mortality, morbidity, and disability risks. Many in late adulthood enjoy better health and social well-being than average and would be aging at an optimal level. Others experience poor health and dependence to a greater extent than would be considered normal. The World Health Organization measures how many equivalent years of full health on average a newborn baby is expected to have. In 2016, the global health life expectancy was about 63 years old and up from about 59 years old in 2000. The WHO Africa region had the lowest health life expectancy at about 54 years old, while the WHO Western Pacific region had the highest at about 69 years old. So we talked about this again, like last chapter. Kind of the idea here is and the kind of the construct, the rationale behind this construct is it's not just kind of important to measure how long someone lives, but kind of the quality of life they live. So how long they're able to kind of be aging at an optimal level, kind of perform everyday tasks, and kind of have enjoyment throughout their lifespan. And there's differences across regions, and this kind of gets back to what the previous slide with low-income countries in general having lower levels of healthy life expectancy, again related to kind of all these historical legacies, lack of food access, lack of medical care, kind of general instability, contributing to lower levels of healthy life expectancy in low-income countries. But I want to look at HLE differences in the U.S. Factors were evaluated in 2007 and 2009 to determine how long an individual currently at age 65 will continue to experience good health. The highest HLE was observed in Hawaii with 16.2 years of additional good health, and the lowest was in Mississippi with only about 11 years of additional good health. Lowest HLE was amongst the southern states. Females had the highest HLE, greater HLE, I should say, than males at age 65 years in every state and Washington, D.C. HLE was greater for whites than for blacks in D.C. and all states from which data were available except in Nevada and New Mexico. Although improvements have occurred in overall life expectancy, children born today may be the first generation to have a lower lifespan than their parents. So we see regional differences in the U.S. We already talked about some with the class, race, disability status, and you kind of can see really there's a correlation here with southern states as well, with kind of less infrastructure, less kind of public health programs probably contributing to these HLA differences. Now, interesting enough, as stated, there you have this kind of Nevada and New Mexico kind of outlier, wherein HLE is not greater for whites than other races or some other races, and we'll get into that a little more. But one potential reason for that is because kind of the cultural support, the protective factors of health within some of these regions. So you think New Mexico, Nevada, they're fairly close to Central and South America, and those kind of rich family environments and kind of Hispanic households possibly contributing to informing protective factors for successful aging across the lifespan. And we'll get into that later on in this lecture. Disability, how is it defined? Basic self-care, activities of daily living, ADLs, dressing, bathing, eating, complex daily tasks such as instrumental activities of daily living, IADLs. These consist of shopping, housework, using transportation, handling finances, medication. Health rating scales ask adults to rate their own health on a scale of 1 to 3, with 3 being poor and 1 being excellent. 40% of adults over 75 rate themselves as excellent/very good. Decline in disability rates. Older adults have higher incomes, more education associated with higher eating, less stress, better medical care. So kind of the idea here is that we have kind of these two constructs, ADLs and IADLs. ADLs being kind of just basic kind of living needed to survive, eating, bathing, being dressed, versus kind of like these more complex tasks which require a little more cognition, a little more mobility, such as sometimes using transportation, driving somewhere, doing housework, handling finances. And we see kind of rates and decline in disability rates, and especially in higher income countries, which could be related to kind of changes in diet, maybe better medical care advancements, so kind of vaccines wiping out polio or something along those lines, which wiping out. Leaving, killing many people and then leaving others disabled. but also how is it defined? And there's kind of a whole debate on what is disability. There's a social model of disability, and we're not kind of being tested on this, but we'll talk about this in discussions of what is disability, what is driving a disabled status, and how that, and kind of the debate of how that should be classified, and kind of that definition that kind of tells you what are kind of potential factors driving kind of disability, and kind of the social model of disability kind of argues that it's kind of these society and kind of these global and kind of government programs. So again, we'll talk about that in our discussions. Okay, now let's talk about some health concerns with aging, beginning with heart disease. Continues to be the #1 cause of death for Americans, as it claimed 23% of those who died in 2017. Not going to go through all these, but advanced age, increased risk for narrowed arteries and weakened or thickened heart muscle, family history of risk, smoking, poor dieting, excessive alcohol consumption, and stress. Chronic stress can damage arteries and worsen other risk factors. And you can again kind of see in statistical terms, the covariance, how intercorrelated these factors are, especially for like the social ones. So we know stress contributes to excessive drinking, smoking, and poor diets. Kind of again speaking to how difficult it is at times to isolate these factors from each other because they're so intercorrelated. Rarely is a person an alcoholic who also is, eating super well, or not smoking at all, or not stressed. These factors are typically correlated, which again kind of really speaks to the accumulation of these risk factors, placing someone at higher risk of developing heart disease. Next, cancer. Cancer can be defined as a collection of related diseases in which the body cells begin to divide without stopping and spread into the surrounding cells. There are more than 100 types of cancers. It is the second leading cause of death for Americans in 2017, as it accounted for 21% of all deaths. Cancer cells can metastasize, break from where they are first formed, called the primary cancer, then travel through the lymph system or blood to form new tumors in other parts of the body. Cancer can start almost anywhere in the human body. Let's differentiate between two different types of tumors. The first, cancerous, are malignant. They can invade nearby tissues. When removed, malignant tumors may grow back, versus benign tumors, who do not invade nearby tissues. Sometimes they can be quite large, and when removed, usually do not grow back. And here, kind of just a basic chart. You can see kind of the typical flow here with the increase of probability of developing cancer increases across the lifespan, and with men being at risk of developing cancers. And obviously, as I stated, there are 100 different kinds of cancers, and some cancers are more different, easy for me to say. Basically, men and women differ on their risks depending on the type of cancer. Cancer research, epigenetic inheritance, environmental events cause changes in gene expression, can occur across lifespan or prenatally. Random mutations, tumor DNA can be examined to determine most effective treatment. Tumors classified by genes rather than locations. Drugs could be based on mutated genes, not body location. 25% decline in cancer deaths in the past 20 years, advances in prevention, HPV vaccine, hepatitis B vaccine, early detection treatment. So kind of the idea here, we talked about epigenetics. So one proposed possible, again, this is kind of theoretical, maybe some kind of risk factor, a genetic predisposition for a risk factor that is associated with developing a particular type of cancer, which is then activated by environmental stressor, or maybe some kind of pollution, or I don't know, some kind of item that's in circulation in the market, and it turns out, oh wait, this is actually linked kind of like to cancer or something. Also random mutations, and interestingly, some researchers have proposed and kind of have begun to research the idea that it's really not the location of the tumor, but rather kind of the genes associated with a tumor. So thus, like a tumor can be associated in the arm, and another can be, I don't know, in your brain, and they can theoretically have similar genetic profiles, and thus identifying those genetic profiles leads to better targeted interventions, because again, you're not looking at the location of the tumor on the body, but kind of what is the genetic makeup of said tumor to kind of theoretically develop more targeted approaches. And I just wanted to copy a couple studies that I grabbed. Prenatal stress enhances NNK-induced lung tumors in AGA mice. So kind of the idea here is just that prenatal stress is a risk factor within these animal models. Mice for lung cancer and major stressful life events and risk of developing lung cancer, a case control study. So some studies have found that this collection of stress across the lifespan contributing to the risk of lung cancer. Now, does that contribute to all cancers? Is that replicated? We don't know. There's still a ton of stuff about cancer we do not know, but that's kind of some of the research. Other risk factors being over 50, tobacco use, unhealthy diet, sedentary lifestyle, excessive alcohol use, and again, kind of just copying a couple studies here. Residential exposure to fine particle matter, air pollution, and incidence of breast cancer in the cohort of Canadian women, air pollution exposure in Denmark. So kind of the idea here, again, pollution contributing to the development of cancer. And again, these are very intercorrelated because who's most likely to live around heavily polluted areas? That's going to be people in lower classes, the poor, minority populations, in Canada, indigenous populations, and disabled populations. And those populations also correlate. They're poor, they're heavily stressed, or in heavily polluted areas, or relatively heavily polluted areas, are also probably have less access to healthy food, less access to recreational activities, kind of contributing to a sedentary lifestyle. So again, kind of speaking to this intercorrelation, we don't exist in a vacuum where each one of these factors are free of influence from each other, but rather kind of existing within a larger developmental context. Environmental hazards, so kind of continuing on a similar theme. Radiation, higher than normal rate of intellectual disability, greater incidence of leukemia and cancer. Documents suggest a single test in 1974 called the Centaur exposed the entire population of Tahiti, about 88,000 people at the time, to nuclear fallout. Only 63 Polynesian civilians have been compensated for radiation exposure since the test ended in 1996. About 100,000 people may have been contaminated in total with leukemia, lymphoma, and other cancers. So kind of, again, speaking to these larger environmental factors contributing to the development of cancer, in this case here, literally just like nuclear testing. And you see this in numerous kind of small island states where kind of large Western or global North, however you want to phrase it, those high income countries kind of testing weaponry, which then contributes to higher rates of various cancers in those native populations. And in this case, Tahiti. Next, diabetes. The body does not control the amount of glucose in the blood. Disease occurs when the body does not make enough insulin or does not use it in the way it should. Insulin is a type of hormone that helps glucose in the blood enter cells to give them energy. In adults, 90 to 95% of all diagnosed cases of diabetes are type 2. Type 2 diabetes usually begins with insulin resistance, a disorder in which the cells in the muscle, liver, and fat tissue do not use insulin properly. 1 in 3 adults are estimated to have prediabetes, and 9 in 10 of them do not know. Without intervention, 15 to 30% of those with prediabetes will develop diabetes within 5 years. So kind of jumping forward to risk factors for diabetes, those being over 45, race and ethnicity, physical activity and diet, and then kind of again grabbing a study here, the link between adverse child experiences and diabetes, with adverse life experiences kind of potentially being correlated or a predictor of later life, adulthood, type 2 diabetes. So again, kind of speaking to the development as a lifespan process, even though we're focusing on adulthood, it's kind of frankly kind of impossible to just completely ignore those first 18 years of your life, because you don't become a new person at 18 years old. You're kind of bringing with you kind of your developmental history. So as stated here, so you have these risk factors, and again kind of correlated physical activity, diet, obesity, for example, and then family history of diabetes being all risk factors for developing diabetes. Aging and dementia. Dementia is a progressive deterioration of neural functioning associated with cognitive decline. It's important to note that this is not part of the normal aging process. It is not a single disorder. In the chart on the right here, you can kind of just see a percentage of individuals with dementia, and then kind of clearly see the increase across the older adulthood. Kind of, again, with the oldest of old being most at risk, but still the kind of super majority of older adults not having dementia. Now, one form and the most common subtype of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. It accounts for 50 to 70% of all cases. It tests for the presence of blood, protein in blood, well said, or cerebral spinal fluid, senile plaques, masses of dying neural material outside neurons with a toxic protein called beta amyloid at their core, neurofibrillary. I was only in speech class for, I don't know, my first 7 years of schooling. Tangles, twisted strands made of neural fibers in the protein tau within the bodies of neural cells. The warning signs: getting lost, having trouble managing money, and paying bills. So kind of we have Alzheimer's here kind of being the most common form of Alzheimer's. We kind of have these neurological markers and also these social markers, such as getting lost in kind of common areas where an individual is quite familiar with or should be familiar with, having trouble paying bills because they can't remember to pay their bills, and having trouble managing money. Continuing on, causes and contributors, genetic effects. Epigenetic effects are being investigated. Traumatic brain injuries increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease, especially in combination with risky genes such as APOE4, unhealthy lifestyle such as poor diet, smoking, inactivity. Physical and mental active people have higher cognitive reserves, which we talked about in the previous chapter. Cognitive capacity that some people can fall back on as aging and disease begin to take a toll on brain functioning. Treatment: there is no cure. Memory training and memory aids and behavioral management techniques. So we have these possible genetic contributors, and we also have these social contributors such as TBI, traumatic brain injury, which is kind of a big thing in the NFL with studies indicating a huge risk factor, basically playing lifetime of football, especially professional football, contributing to the risk of Alzheimer's disease. But interestingly, kind of speaking to that epigenetic process, or kind of the gene and environment interacting, individuals with a particular risky gene, such as this APOE4 gene, kind of being at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's when they also have a traumatic brain injury. Alongside these other healthy diets, pointing out the behavioral management techniques. So kind of the idea here is alongside memory aids and kind of cues around the house, kind of giving people reminders that, oh, you need to pay your bill, or this is where you're going. And so kind of adapting your environment and managing behavior depending on the severity of the Alzheimer's. And you really don't need to know the chart at the right, on the right at all. It's kind of just a theoretical model in which stress may contribute to an increased likelihood of developing dementia. But again, it's kind of just, it's theoretical and it's not required for the quiz. Previous literature and studies suggest that healthy lifestyles combats Alzheimer's, or the potential development of Alzheimer's disease. Researchers followed a diverse group of about 2,800 participants for 9 years and focused on 5 low-risk lifestyle factors. Healthy diet, at least 150 minutes / week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, not smoking, light to moderate alcohol intake, and engaging in cognitively stimulating activities. The results indicate that those who adopt 4 or 5 low-risk lifestyle factors had a 60% lower risk of Alzheimer's disease when compared with participants who did not follow any or only one of the low risks. So kind of, again, speaking to the environmental risk factors and the impact of kind of lifestyles on the risk of developing Alzheimer's. But again, you can kind of see the intercorrelation here. In general, people who have a bad diet are also at higher risk of smoking and having high rates of alcohol use and having cognitively stimulating daily activities for a whole host of reasons, just related to kind of class, race, resources in the community, family resources, financial resources, all kind of contributing to and predicting the likelihood of said, in this case, risk factors for Alzheimer's. Psychological disorders. Three most prevalent categories are anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, substance-related and addictive disorders, and now we're going to talk about the DSM. The DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's a diagnostic system that contains the APA, that is the American Psychology Association criteria for mental disorders. It contains lists of criteria for diagnosing each condition and decision rules for how many criteria need to be met in order to be classified for a particular condition. Warns diagnosticians to, quote, think organic and rule out physical causes first. Substance use or mental disorders can mimic depression, hypothyroidism, contain information on prevalence of many mental health disorders, adopts a biopsychosocial approach. The view that illness or a medical condition is the product of an interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. Okay, so some quick things to point out here. DSM-5, there are different diagnostic manuals across the world. So this is one manual originating in the US, thus the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association. So there are other models in the world, but this is kind of the one we work with. We live in the US. Also, it's important to note that diagnosticians are, again, told to think organic, which basically means that there are a number of physical illnesses that mimic the symptoms of psychological conditions. So, as stated, hypothyroidism, kind of mimicking the symptoms of depression or substance use disorders. So kind of you can make a mistake as a diagnostician, not if you didn't check for an individual's thyroid first, coming to the conclusion that that person is depressed, but really they actually have a physical condition, hypothyroidism in their thyroid system. And it adopts a biopsychosocial approach, which just states that health and development, basically in general, is impacted by your biology, your social factors, including your environment, again, not just your interpersonal family dynamics, but these larger countrywide economic, political environments, and your personal and kind of collective psychology. And kind of considering that biopsychosocial approach, there were changes in the DSM-5 criteria with greater latitude for diagnosing depression for those grieving, attention to how age, gender, and race or ethnicity may affect diagnosis. It recognizes that both cultural and developmental considerations should be taken into account. Asian Americans may explain symptoms in physical terms, body symptoms such as tiredness and aches. So kind of as stated, it's important to keep in mind the developmental context, the culture in which an individual is from, because one might be kind of not normative, and one culture may be more normative in another culture. Also, different cultures describe their symptoms in different terms, some using physical terms such as Asian Americans, and this kind of replicated across other studies that we won't get into. Asian countries, broadly stated Asian countries, being a higher likelihood of describing their condition in physical terms versus kind of psychological or mental terms. And kind of, again, an emphasis on these. And I should actually state that greater latitude for diagnosing depression for those grieving. So kind of the idea here is an individual who encounters a particular environment may react or a social circumstance may react in a certain way. So the 80-year-old husband or wife kind of losing their spouse dies, they're going to grieve, and that grief does not necessarily mean depression. So again, kind of taking into account kind of the social context in which various conditions are being displayed by an individual. Anxiety disorders, which can be broadly defined as a feeling of fear, dread, when no obvious danger is present. The most common type of mental health disorders are phobias and social anxieties. It usually begins in childhood. It is more common in women. One possible approach is psychotherapy, but I should note, and you're kind of not going to get too big of a kind of digression here, but kind of this idea of universal psychotherapy is not applicable across all contexts. So you kind of see a common mistake historically of Westerners kind of going into a war-torn area in the global South, maybe an African context or something along those lines, and kind of trying to apply the kind of Western or American kind of idea of psychotherapy, kind of stripping someone kind of from their context, sitting with them one-on-one and kind of, you know, going through their symptoms or whatever, can actually kind of like backfire and increase the risk of long-term or short-term negative developmental impacts, because you're kind of stripping an individual and removing them from their social support. This is more of kind of collectivist approach to kind of healing and dealing with various trauma, and so kind of thus kind of stripping people away from that kind of protective factor, and kind of having them express themselves individually can actually be detrimental to recovery efforts. Some risk factors include shyness in childhood, being female, a family history of anxiety disorders, exposure to stressful life events, and poverty. And again, kind of just grabbing one study here, looking at males with young adults who are male and kind of have various problematic young adults. And just kind of, you can see the red underline here. Looking at this study, so again, sorry, we're talking about adverse child life events. Sample of 643 multi-problem young adult men, ranging from 18 to 27 years old, so kind of like emerging adulthood and then early adulthood. Grew up in a single-family home, showed that emotional abuse and emotional neglect were positively associated with internalizing problems. So kind of, again, this accumulation of these challenges within subgroups of individuals, high poverty homes, racial minorities, disabled, etc., kind of contributing to and predicting, in this case here, internalizing problems between 18 and 27 years old. Next, I want to talk about social anxiety disorder across cultures. Social anxiety disorder can be defined as the fear of acting in an inept and unacceptable manner, and that such behavior will lead to disastrous social consequences. It's documented universally, reflecting universal concerns that we share as social beings. Some cultural differences: for instance, there is a higher experience of symptoms in East Asians. Asian Americans report more social anxiety symptoms than white Americans. Also, a link between interdependence and heightened social anxiety symptoms, while independence is associated with less discomfort in social situations. Suggests that there's cultural connection between social harmony and the experience of social anxiety. However, there is a lower perception that social anxiety is problematic in East Asian countries. Extreme shyness is perceived less negatively in Asian contexts than Western ones. One study showed that Chinese children who were evaluated as shy were viewed more positively by peers and teachers, whereas Western children evaluated as shy were more likely to be rejected by peers. So let's continue on before kind of breaking it down. There is a paradox of East Asians experiencing more symptoms but not meeting the clinical criteria for social anxiety disorder. It may be due to differences in what behaviors are considered culturally normative. In Western culture, the norm is for people to be extroverted. In Eastern Asian cultures, the norm is for people to be introverted. Because social anxiety is viewed as less problematic in East Asian countries, it may be that people are less troubled by having social discomfort when it's common to be concerned about interpersonal relationships. It's important to note that clinical diagnosis need to account not only for symptoms, but also for the perception of what is normative. And we kind of already alluded to this with the DSM approach to diagnosing various psychological disorders. But here you can kind of the impact of and how important culture is. And here you can see Asian Americans reporting higher levels of social anxiety symptoms than white Americans, and kind of Asian individuals in East Asian countries experiencing more social anxiety disorder symptoms. And one proposed reason is kind of this idea of interdependency, this idea of kind of this collective sense of self and dependency, the importance of like the collective of your inner circle to yourself and those around you. So kind of versus kind of like your independent self versus kind of like more of an independent culture wherein kind of I'm this independent entity, I'm doing my own thing. If I don't like something, I'll just leave, and I'll get rid of that friend, and it's not that big of a deal because I am my own self, and I'm unchanged. Other people are not going to like change who I am, and thus, when I kind of act in a non-normative way, or I kind of act out in kind of a setting, it's really not a bad thing, because I'm kind of like shining bright as an independent person or something along those lines, versus kind of the idea of this interdependent self and kind of worrying that the actions that you take are going to kind of disrupt the social harmony, the group anxiety, and kind of thus having, one possible reason why East Asians, not just East Asian Americans or Asian Americans, but also kind of East Asian countries more, on average, I should say, experiencing kind of more symptoms of social anxiety. But interestingly, kind of the evaluation of said social anxieties are perceived differently, with, as stated, Chinese children being evaluated more positively by their peers and teachers than kind of less shy children, with the inverse kind of being the case in Western children, specifically kind of in the US, where shy individuals kind of more likely to be kind of be rejected by their peers and kind of be targeted kind of for like intervention of kind of helping a person kind of blossom into a more independent or somewhat social self. Thus, this like evaluation of the need to protect the group, that collective experience, maintain harmony, that social understanding, that norm within that culture, should impact and does impact kind of the idea that that is not necessarily a disorder, a social anxiety disorder within that context, because it is normative in that context, and it's believed to kind of be important to that group setting. Versus in a different context, where more independent, more or less worrying about kind of like in groups kind of thing, the idea of social anxiety and shyness would be kind of viewed more as a more likely to be viewed as a kind of a social anxiety disorder. Depressive disorders. Major depressive disorder is the most common or prevalent depressive disorder. It is the second most prevalent disorder. I immediately contradicted myself. Second most prevalent disorder. I was looking up different kind of rates, and people have different calculations of the rates of major depressive disorder. It doesn't matter. It's number one or number two. It is the leading cause of disability in the world and the leading cause of suicide. Prevalence is 3 times higher in young adults, twice as high for women than men. Older adults likely to go undiagnosed may believe depressive symptoms are part of an aging process, and medication and psychotherapy are 2 forms of kind of individual treatments for depressive disorder. Kind of as stated, serious disorder across kind of the world, leading cause of suicide, with different rates depending on gender, with being twice as high as for women than men. And older adults, interesting enough, kind of going back to that internalization of ageism and like this idea that, oh, I'm only going to feel worse throughout as I age. I'm going to be more social isolated. My body's going to fall apart. My mental capacity is going to fall apart. Thus, older adults can incorrectly assume that kind of this disorder is a natural part of the aging process, when it is not. Some risk factors include personal family history of depression, being female, major life changes, trauma, poverty, unemployment, alcohol or drug abuse, death of a loved one, relationship breakup. And just highlighting one international study from Brisbane, Australia, who recruited mothers in early pregnancy and whose children were followed up at ages 14 and 21 years old, so kind of a longitudinal study. Poverty at the 14-year follow-up was the strongest predictor of adolescence and young adult anxiety and depression. The more frequently the child was exposed to poverty, the greater the risk was that the individual being anxious or depressed at 20 years old. The increased frequency of child exposure to poverty is a consistent predictor of adolescence and young adult anxiety and depression. So kind of the idea here is that this accumulation of poverty, the longer an individual lives in poverty, the more likely they are to experience anxiety and depression as a young adult. Again, speaking to these environmental influences on various psychological disorders, in this case, anxiety and depression. And as I said before, we had kind of the 2 possible kind of
treatments or mitigation approaches through medication and psychotherapy to kind of address major depressive disorder and anxiety. But also it's important to note that we also have these large structural public health programs that can also kind of address these risk factors for anxiety and depression. So if we understand that family poverty is linked to anxiety and depression, programs that target poverty and political and economic systems that exacerbate poverty are kind of contributing to the increase in the risk factors for anxiety and depression. So again, kind of not just looking at these individual personal treatment approaches, but these collective structural approaches to addressing poverty and psychological disorders in adulthood, and in this study, young adulthood. MDD has been found in all cultures that people have studied, although rates of prevalence appear to vary. Rates of prevalence of depression vary in the United States based on diagnostic criteria. Some surveys have found rates of 5% to 17%, and under less strict criteria as high as 44% at any one time. Rate in China is about 1/5 that observed in the US, and some non-Western countries, cultures have higher rates than the West. Nigeria, for example, had about 4 times the US rate of MDD in 1999. In depression across cultures, depressed individuals may exhibit different symptoms. Depressed white Americans show decreased emotional responses, while depressed Asian Americans show exaggerated responses to the same emotional eliciting stimuli. Cultural variability in types of symptoms or the way they are manifested. Somatization, symptoms are primarily physical, such as loss of appetite. Psychologization, symptoms are primarily psychological, such as suppressed mood. So we kind of have differences in how the symptoms of depression are manifested in across cultures, and kind of the descriptions of said symptoms. So with Asian Americans being more likely to describe their depression in physical terms versus white Americans being more likely to describe their depression in primarily psychological terms, in reacting to the same stimuli differently. So you can show the same stimuli to different groups, and one study found that white Americans show decreased emotional response, while Asian Americans showing exaggerated responses to the same, again, emotional eliciting stimuli, which again illustrates kind of the impact of culture on the manifestation and the description of these symptoms across adulthood and across cultures. And interestingly, a study in rural Uganda found that exposure to adverse childhood experiences impact adult depression and suicide ideology. And just some of the questions that were asked: in your first 14 or 18 years of life, were you verbally abused? Were you physically harmed? Were you exposed to injury? Or you was slapped, like physically assaulted in any way. So kind of, again, demonstrating across cultures that these the accumulation of these stressors manifesting themselves in adulthood, in this case depression, and as we already talked about, that the exact symptoms and the description of symptoms do vary across cultures. Suicide. Major depression and bipolar disorder is associated with higher risk of suicide than most disorders. More than 40,000 people commit suicide in the U.S. Each year. It's the 10th leading cause of death. The single best predictor of suicide is a previous attempt. 35% of people who commit suicide tried it at least one prior time. It's difficult to determine the exact causes. Men commit suicide more than women, but it is believed that women try to commit suicide more than men. Other risk factors include feelings of hopelessness, depression, unemployment, illness, old age, substance abuse. So we have kind of these risk factors, and we have one kind of indicator of suicide being a previous attempt at suicide, and differences across gender. But it's kind of, as stated, it's important to note that kind of the avenues in which the different genders try to commit suicide are different, with women kind of taking more of a kind of maybe overdosing on medication, for example, which then body can kind of reject that, induce vomiting, and then an individual will live. Thus, maybe the two genders have similar rates of attempts at suicide, but due to the nature of the attempts, differences in suicide rates across the genders. And some other risk factors include depression and unemployment, hopelessness, so kind of straightforward here, losing kind of your sense of self, your place in the world, maybe your community, losing kind of social prestige, and just feeling contributing to kind of a larger collective, a community, family, something along those lines, contributing to the increase in the risk of suicide. Substance-related and addictive disorders. There are 9 separate classes of drugs plus gambling, and I'm not going to read them all. But I'm going to focus on opioids. It's a synthetic drugs resembling natural opiates developed by pharmaceutical companies. Opioid use can lead to addiction, respiratory arrest, coma, and death. The worst drug crisis in American history, an increase of overdose deaths, more than gun crashes and gun homicides. So this is kind of an important note. We're kind of living in this historical moment right now where we have massive rates of opioid overdose deaths. So kind of like this Bronfenbrenner terms, this chrono system of a very high rates of opioid overdoses, and thus kind of it's important to understand why, what is maybe possibly driving this increase in overdose deaths from opioids. And one possible mechanism, which was identified by researchers out of Princeton, is deaths of despair. Health has deteriorated faster in middle-aged white Americans, and in particular because of premature deaths due to suicide, drugs, and alcohol, the so-called deaths of despair. U.S. life expectancy drops for 3rd year in a row, reflecting rising drug overdoses, suicides. The longest sustained decline in the expected lifespan since the tumultuous period of 1915 to 1918. The suicide rate among urban residents, 11 per 100,000 people, as opposed to rural residents, 20 per 100,000 people. It's linked to deindustrialization, loss of identity, and dignity in society. So this is kind of, again, kind of relating to the fact that these economic systems, these political systems impact developmental outcomes. And these charts are from this book, Death of Despair, from these Princeton researchers that I read. And kind of the idea here is that these deaths of despair, again, kind of suicide, drugs, alcohol, all kind of interrelated, this feeling of despair, hopelessness, depression, which are possibly linked to deindustrialization, kind of a loss of your place in society, your dignity, your influence in society. So the individuals are more isolated, working at kind of a less fulfilling jobs, maybe having to go into a service industry or a job that they weren't trained in. And this has particularly impacted individuals either without a college degree or kind of a low level, less than a bachelor's degree. You see very concentrated rates in increases in deaths of despair. Again, kind of reflecting these larger shifts in politics and economics, wherein jobs that existed that could provide for a family with less than a bachelor's degree have significantly declined. And even frankly, for people with bachelor's degrees, and you can kind of actually see increases starting to begin there as well. But you can definitely see this stark difference in rural residents who have less social infrastructure, less healthy food, community activities, transportation, social links alongside. So you're losing so you kind of have low resources while losing kind of your source of livelihood, but not just your source of livelihood, but kind of like your identity as a worker. You're working in a job, you feel like you're contributing to society. That is now gone. You feel like you have kind of less influence in the world. You're kind of left behind, and thus kind of contributing to this increase in deaths of despair, and primarily through not just only, but kind of increases in opioid deaths, kind of this psychological pain contributing to, again, deaths of despair. And I should note that it's theorized that this is primarily among white non-Hispanic ages 45 to 54. So kind of the idea is that these individuals, and maybe coming from households who previously had a historical legacy working in these particular industries, or they were laid off. They had the job themselves, and now they're laid off, and now you're that relative decline from a place of, relative financial security and privilege, like kind of that decline contributing to that sense of that loss, thus decreasing their lifespan. The first time, I think, in Western countries since World War II, this multi-year process of declining lifespan, especially in that 54 or 45 to 54 white non-Hispanic age range. In the interest of time, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Racial and class differences and health outcomes. Older adults who are African American, Mexican American, and Asian American experience psychological problems that are often associated with discrimination by the white majority. Ethnic minorities are also more likely to become sick, but less likely to receive medical intervention. Older minority women can face ageism, racism, and sexism, often referred to as triple jeopardy. So here we kind of have a racial impact of psychological problems, psychological disorders, the development of said psychological disorders across the lifespan, with historically disenfranchised races being at higher risk of developing psychological disorders, and not only that, but when they are less likely to receive medical intervention, which is related to kind of the under-resourced communities, classically a correlation between Black Americans and poverty and Hispanic Americans in poverty. So kind of that combination of underinvestment, racism, kind of contributing to higher increases of or risk of psychological disorders, negative health outcomes, but also once reaching or seeking medical intervention, research suggests that kind of receiving a different quality of care as opposed to more wealthy or richer, higher class individuals, all kind of contributing to a greater risk factor. And especially there's obviously kind of this accumulation effect that we've talked about before with the accumulation of stress across time. But older minority women kind of facing ageism, racism, sexism, kind of accumulating together to place them at greater risk of developing psychological disorders. The poverty rate for older adults varies based on gender, marital status, race, and age. Women aged 65 or older were 70% more likely to be poor than men. Women aged 80 and above have higher levels of poverty than those younger. Married couples are less likely to be poor than non-married men and women. In 2012, the poverty rates of white older men, 5.6%, and white older women, about 10%, were lower than for Black older men, 14%, Black older women, 21%, Hispanic older men, 19%, and Hispanic older women, 22%. So kind of a few things here to unpack. We have women being at highest risk of kind of poverty, and you can see an age difference. And one of the social reasons, again speaking to these larger structures, is that imagine 80-year-old, they developed, they grew up, they worked in a time where there was kind of less access to and kind of more restrictions on women entering the workplace. So thus kind of they have longer employment and kind of more precarious jobs, so maybe service economy, something along those lines, which also don't offer kind of like long-term benefits at the same rates as other jobs do, so 401ks, various retirement plans. Thus, in combination with men dying earlier, then women kind of being a single income earner, and even though they're collecting some of the maybe some earnings, they're still losing kind of an earner. They're losing that extra Social Security check, for example. And thus, kind of the older you are, and if you're a woman, being at a higher risk of living in poverty. And also you can see here kind of the rates of poverty with varying between 5.6% all the way up to 22%. So again, kind of this interaction between race and class. Again, not like all, there's obviously a variability within that, but kind of the higher risk factor and this, the correlation being stronger for racial minorities in poverty. However, there are still numerous older adults across all races that live in poverty and thus are have an increased risk of developing psychological disorders. And negative physical health outcomes. Moving on to mortality in class. General health, though, is also affected by different aspects of our cultural environment, such as class indicators like household incomes. Mortality rates are higher among lower income Americans. Pattern can be found in other industrialized countries as well as certain non-industrialized countries. So kind of the idea here being, and you can see on the graph, that depending on your household income, you have a higher risk of dying earlier, with the highest income at 2 million having about, let's see here, they're about at 88 years old for women. And I don't know, 87 for men, we'll just make that up. And then look at the lowest income bracket here, below 25,000, with men living about 72 years old. So you have a gigantic gap, over a decade difference between these two classes. And again, as stated in the previous slide, with kind of intercorrelation with race also being kind of correlated here, alongside markers such as disability status. Class and psychosocial development. Income levels appear to be associated with links to health via several psychosocial variables. Certain personality characteristics, such as hostility and pessimism. This is likely to be due to lower school achievement in low-income environments, which bars people from certain employment opportunities. Such environments also lead them to encounter more delinquent and criminally dangerous behaviors. These experiences may foster a sense of mistrust and cynicism. All this leads to a sense of hostility and pessimism, contributing to poor health. Another psychosocial link is the availability of cognitive resources to make sound decisions. Impoverished people are more likely to engage in short-term strategies that undermine decision-making. Poverty preoccupies people with having to make difficult choices and trade-offs for survival, which siphons mental resources away from higher-order decisions. For instance, sugarcane farmers in southern India performed better on cognitive tasks after they harvested their crops, when they had sufficient income, compared to before harvesting their crops, when they were worried about how to pay their bills. So kind of the idea here is that there are obviously developmental consequences at a psychological level for living in poverty. And a couple of examples are hostility and pessimism. So you can imagine, attending a poorly developed school, very low resources, maybe mold everywhere, and there's holes, and there's not enough books or desks, etc. And kind of that combination of stressors alongside, living in a rough neighborhood and lacking other resources, other protective factors of development, contributing to the likelihood of a kind of performing worse in school or dropping out. And then that kind of dropout then kind of sets a developmental trajectory, or lower grades kind of submitting a developmental trajectory wherein as an adult you're more likely to be incarcerated or work low-income jobs and kind of just have in an individual's mind, no future, and kind of this feeling of being let down creates kind of a feeling of mistrust and cynicism and pessimism and hostility to the world. Thus, kind of all that stress kind of contributing to poor health. You maybe do healthy eating choices, lack of exercise, maybe not visiting a doctor, to the extent that you have access to a doctor. So kind of just general mistrust, the stress, the cynicism, all contributing to and all developing from kind of like, everything that you've interacted with in the world is kind of like let you down, or at least compared to other relatively wealthier classes, having far less resources, kind of giving you a cynicism of the world. And also cognitive resources. So we're in kind of this preoccupation with poverty, trying to deal with how to survive every single day, not just yourself, but your family, your children, your friends, depending on the danger in your neighborhood, etc. Kind of preoccupying an individual constantly, and thus not having kind of the cognitive resources, because cognition is not infinite. You only have X amount of resources and energy per day. So kind of that kind of preoccupation with short-term survival, kind of interrupting or increasing the likelihood of short-term decision-making, which is kind of adaptive because you have to survive every day. But over the long term, that can be harmful for the various developmental outcomes. And you can also see this in a cross-cultural study of these Indian croppers, rural Indian croppers, wherein after they perform their harvest, and that's kind of that stress, that focus on, I need to have this harvest done or I'm going to starve to death, or I'm going to be in massively debt, they perform better on these kind of cognitive tasks, again, kind of because they freed up those cognitive resources. And we already talked about this in the other chapter, but this concept of allostatic load, which is basically defined as the cumulative wear and tear on the body systems owing to repeated adaptation to stressors related to cellular aging, clinical health diagnosis, and telomere length, which we also discussed in a previous chapter. And it's kind of, you can just basically imagine this as a summation of all these different biological outcomes, C-reactive protein, blood pressure, BMI, etc. And kind of that collection of those numbers kind of generated together into one composite score, and the higher that composite score, the more kind of theoretical cumulative wear and tear on the body, the worse overall health that individual has. And that composite allostatic load score is correlated and linked to age, class, nutrition, race, substance use, stress, and infections. And in return, as stated, the higher that allostatic load, the higher rates of that blood pressure, body mass index, etc., is correlated and predictive of psychological and physical developmental outcomes across adulthood. And some studies have looked at this. Also, this allostatic load is also referred to as weathering. And here's just sort of one little chart here, and just kind of I've grabbed some bullet points from it. In each group, the mean score for blacks were roughly compared to that of whites who were 10 years older. Black women bear a large burden of allostatic load compared with either black men or white women. We found little difference among whites in mean score by gender until age 55 years old. Black women had higher scores than black men at all age studied. So kind of the idea here is that the allostatic load, so you can collect someone's allostatic load at each age range and then obviously compare across race and ages. And what the study found was that black women had, and in general, black individuals had allostatic loads that were comparable to whites who were 10 years older. So if you can imagine, it's an accumulation of kind of the biological wear and tear we'll say 60 years old, say, black individuals having the allostatic load of 70-year-olds, while white individuals having the allostatic loads at 60 years old, corresponding to their age. And again, these are kind of this conceptual example here. But interestingly, black women having the highest allostatic load compared with either white men or white women. So again, kind of suggesting this interaction between sexism, racism, and ageism combining to increase this composite biological measurement of wear and tear on the body, that is allostatic load. Now, one thing I want to point out is something called the epidemiological paradox. The epidemiological paradox is Latinos experience good health across a variety of conditions, including disadvantaged conditions in the United States. So, one prominent explanation supported by data is that Hispanic Americans engage in healthier behaviors than do white Americans, example by drinking and smoking less. They benefit from much social support from large communities and highly value-raising families. Unusual high levels of positive affect is a cultural norm with cultural scripts such as simpatico. There are possible explanations for why Latinos have such healthy outcomes, but much of the epidemiological paradox remains unresolved. The paradox does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. Puerto Ricans, for example, do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans. So kind of the idea here is that, interestingly, there is this paradox wherein Hispanic Americans have better psychological outcomes and physical outcomes across a number of health outcomes indicators. And this is a paradox because, as kind of stated, they're more likely to, or higher rates of poverty within this population. And some possible explanations are that they engage in less drinking behavior, they smoke less, but also, interestingly, they have possibly more levels of social support from these large communities, thus kind of acting as this social protective, this collective protection, sharing resources, not just financial, but social resources to protect themselves, buffer themselves against stressors from poverty and discrimination. Interestingly, though, the longer Hispanic groups stay in the U.S. and across generations, this health benefits actually declines. And it does not apply to all Latino groups. So, for example, Puerto Ricans do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans. And this could be due to a whole host of possible reasons, such as, Puerto Rico's status is basically kind of the de facto colony, but we don't say the word colony anymore. So thus maybe that lack of independent status, or that kind of being in that directly in that American sphere of influence, but not having the same levels of control of their lives, not having electoral college votes, for example, not having the same access to the public health programs that we have in the that we have kind of in the mainland United States. Maybe contributing to kind of a decrease in social support, a decrease of maybe collective identity, and thus having less health benefits in that population. But again, this is kind of all theoretical. All right, and we're going to wrap up with LGBT older adults. Older lesbian and gay adults are one of the least researched demographic groups. Compared to heterosexuals, lesbian and gay adults experience both physical and mental health differences. More than 40% of lesbian and gay adults ages 50 and older suffer from at least one chronic illness or disabilities. Compared to heterosexuals, they are more likely to smoke or binge drink. Gay older adults have an increased risk of prostate cancer and infection from HIV and other sexually transmitted illnesses. When compared to heterosexuals, lesbian and gay elders have less support from others, as they're twice as likely to live alone and 4 times less likely to have children. So this is kind of like the opposite that we just talked about with Hispanic Americans, with older lesbian and gay adults growing up in a different era where, until whatever it was, 7 years ago, gay marriage was not legal in the United States. But, even beyond that, open discrimination, kind of going back to, for historical junkies out there, Stonewall riots. Not tested on that, that's fine. But kind of the idea here is open discrimination, violence against these communities, open ostracization from their family, thus kind of losing that social support and having less social resources, having less financial resources, because you can just fire someone for being gay or trans, etc. And thus kind of contributing to higher risk of certain negative developmental outcomes. Lesbian and gay older adults who belong to ethnic and cultural minorities, conservative religions, and rural communities may face additional stressors. Ageism, sexism, classism, racism can combine cumulatively and impact the older adult beyond the negative impact of each individual form of discrimination. Older gay black men reported higher rates of racism than younger gay black men and higher rates of perceived ageism than older gay white men. The oldest lesbian and gay adults came of age in the 1950s when there were no laws to protect them from victimization. Future lesbian and gay elders will have different developmental experiences due to the legal right for same-sex marriage and greater social acceptance. Granted, that's a lot of projection of who knows what will happen in the future. But kind of the idea here is that you have that accumulation. So now you have ageism, sexism, classism, racism, combining with homophobia or transphobia, all cumulatively impacting developmental outcomes. And those different isms varying across environments. So maybe one community, one state has different, more homophobic laws or more access to resources, so allowing gay adoption or something along those lines. So kind of the ability to, or protection in the workplace. So kind of having more social protection, more kind of government protection, and contributing to different developmental outcomes. And finally, we're going to wrap up with the impact of COVID impact on trans youth. So since this pandemic began, the crisis calls to Trans Lifeline and crisis telephone lines staffed by transgender people have risen 40% and continue to climb. So you can kind of see here in the upper right-hand corner, differences in stress levels and kind of the topics of calls to this crisis hotline for COVID. So you kind of hear COVID, you have impacting different groups differently. So groups who are greater at risk, in this case trans youth, impacting their stress levels, their mental health outcomes. And you can see here that the majority of the calls touching on suicide ideation and then third one down being lack of trans community. So kind of this new population level stressor impacting those at risk at disproportionate rates. And this is kind of a consistent finding across research, and you can only to speculate right now, but kind of the impact of different transphobic legislation impacting developmental outcomes. Okay, so with that said, we're going to wrap it up there. Close to an hour, a little over, about 8 minutes over. But thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next week. Thanks a lot.